thank you to everybody. So Ford lives in Freeport, which for those of you that aren't near, is nearby, and has been on these waters for years, and with his family. And if you know Reiche School, that is part of his family.
Sure? Okay.
And always had an interest in the lighthouse, and can't believe that he ended up buying it and went through the process. But I actually asked him at lunch if he had fun, and he said yes. So he has restored several buildings on the National Register of Historic Places. He won. He's a lawyer by trade, but an entrepreneur. And in 2008, he won the Maine Small Business Person of the Year award. And then since he's done this project, in 2016, he won the Preservation Award from Maine. And 2017, Keeper of the Lighthouse by American Lighthouse Foundation Award.
Wow.
So it's a remarkable process. And for any of you that would like to have more of a visual, he has slides he's going to show us. There is a film in Netflix and one on Amazon, and some of our community members have watched that.
That was awesome.
That was really wonderful,
Really?
yes.
Yeah.
So he has another project that he's going to talk about preservation, which he has to leave for afterwards. But we're going to do a Q&A and maybe quickly sign some books, and then we have to let him go. So I thank Ford for coming and making this commitment and being here with us today. Thank you.
I want to thank Chris and her family for hosting me and showing me. I've been around the island before, but giving me a good tour and a nice lunch, so thank you very much. So I brought a case of books to donate to the library, and I'm going to pass it around. If you buy one, it goes to them, and if you don't, then you can sell them some other time. But I'm also going to pass it around because Chris asked me to talk a little bit at the end about writing a book. So I've got some comments on that, and if you look at the book when I pass it around, it might give you a question or two.
Nice. Yeah.
So I'm going to sit down, but I'll be up when I've got a longer story, but I need to see my screen while we're talking.
I know I want.
Everyone can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Good. So the lighthouses were a central part of everything to do with the water, and now they aren't. And the reason is largely because of GPS. When I, and other people in this room who are my age or older, when we used to navigate, it was slide rules, dividers, paper chart, and a pencil, and that was it. And that's the way it had been for centuries. And when that was the way of navigation, you needed aids to navigation. You needed lighthouses, and because that was home base for everything. Now, your phone's got radar and weather and buoy and all the navigational data, so you just don't need them anymore. So the government found it is a huge government responsibility. They decided they had to sell them off. So there's been a sale all over the country of lighthouses, and sometimes lighthouses don't have anyone who wants them if it's in a remote place, and that's a sad outcome. And then there are others like Halfway Rock that are of some interest. But before I get into all that, I want to give you a little bit of history. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of lighthouses generally, history of Halfway Rock, my experience buying it and restoring it, and then I'll be happy to answer your questions. This is my cousin, not Ann, who's one of my cousins, but on the other side, my cousin is Bill Shuttleworth, who was a state historian for a long time. And so as soon as I even started bidding on Halfway Rock, I was reaching out to historians and doing a lot of research about Halfway Rock. And he sent me this from the state archive, and it's the earliest depiction that exists that anyone knows of Halfway Rock, and it's the second year that it was in existence. It's before there was a boathouse. It's 1872 by Toothaker, who was from Hopswell. He was the second lighthouse keeper. And on the back of this drawing, this rock, so long, the terror of seamen approaching Casco Bay lies midway between Cape Elizabeth and Cape Small. The rock is 14 feet above mean sea level, measures 1/4 acre without a particle of earth. And there, as you know, we're here. Here's Cliff. Halfway Rock is midway between Cape Small to the east, Cape Elizabeth, and this is all of our Casco Bay. And it's a harsh place. And a lot of what I'm going to show you is just what happened to Halfway Rock over the years, and then when the Coast Guard left it 45 years ago, what happened just when Mother Nature had free reign of the place. But I go out there sometimes and it's like this, and I have to come home. And if you look around, you don't see any whitecaps. You get away from the rock. It's not a very rough day, and that's just what can happen because the turbulence deep under the surface gets brought up by that ledge. The lighthouse was staffed for 105 years, from 1871 to 1976. No one ever left the lighthouse for a hurricane. When it was staffed around the clock without exception. It was automated in 1976, and that was the end of staffing out there. In 1988, it was put on the National Register, and we all know about buildings that are on the National Register, and I know a lot about it, and it doesn't do anything to save a building, putting it on the National Register. It doesn't even put restrictions on what you can do with it, unless you're using federal money to restore it, or unless you're buying it from the government. So I had all strings attached. I had to do all sorts of things with oversight because it was on the National Register. In 2004, it served as the poster child on this National Lighthouse magazine for what they call the Doomsday List, America's Most Endangered Lighthouses, and Halfway Rock was chosen for the cover in 2004 because it was imperiled. 2005, Maine Preservation, which is the statewide version of Greater Portland Landmarks, similar, put it on the state of Maine's Most Endangered Historic Structures list. And then in 2014, as I said, the government decided they were going to sell it. Before I get into the sale and restoration process, a little more about history. Lighthouses. This is a 1922 map of the first lighthouse district, and the lighthouse service was a big part of the federal government back when the federal government was small. We had the military, we had the postal service, we had the lighthouse service, and that was kind of it for its infrastructure, so they took it very seriously. And each one of those black dots is a lighthouse, and they were very expensive to build and to maintain. They didn't build a lighthouse unless they had an important reason, and there were three reasons. If you had a spot which was a real hazard to navigation, even if it wasn't near anything, you put a lighthouse or a buoy on it. If you were near, which applies to Halfway Rock, if you were near a busy port, they would put a lighthouse there on the mainland, like Portland Headlight or Halfway Rock. They would put lighthouses near the entrance to busy ports. And then even if there's nothing there, no hazard, no big port, they'd space them out equally. So as you're going along the coast, as you're losing the view of the lighthouse behind you, you're just starting to see visually the next one ahead of you. So those are the reasons. And there was a saying for vessels coming out of Penobscot Bay or coming from down east back to Portland, the lighthouse, the kind of a rhyme for the lighthouses you'd see was first Monhegan, then Seguin, Halfway Rock, and then you're in. And this was at a point in time when everything moved by water. Portland is, you know Maine's remote, and everything came and went from this busy place by water. The railroad came in. Railroad started serving Portland in 1850, and you'd think that might have reduced reliance on water, but it actually doubled it, because when the railroad came to Commercial Street out of Canada, that was to open up all of central Canada to year-round shipping traffic because the St. Lawrence Seaway froze up. So we doubled in 1851. Right after that, we doubled the traffic in and out of Portland Harbor. So it was these aids to navigation were central to commerce. This is the first photograph of Halfway Rock, and again, if you folks know Halfway Rock, you know there's a two-story boathouse out there, and that was not built until 18 years later. They built, if you had a nice place to put a lighthouse, like with pastures and so forth, you'd allow families to live there, and you'd set it up with a separate barn and a separate home. But if you just had a greasy little rock, people would live in the tower, because there was nothing, everything else washed away. And so this was called the Stag Lighthouse. Families were not allowed out there. It's also called the Wave Swept Lighthouse because it's wave swept. And so they originally thought that everything would be lost if you weren't just living in the tower. So the tower is these granite blocks that came from down east, and they brought them to House Island. House Island had been where they set up, they did a lot of the granite work for the forts during the Civil War. And because that capability was still there, they did lighthouses out of there as well. So the rough stone came out from down east. It was brought to in boats made on Chebeague Island called granite sloops. Brought to House Island, where they carved them stone by stone, and then took them out to the Halfway Rock and unloaded them. They'd bring the stone sloop alongside, hopefully on a day like this when it's somewhat calm, and they'd use the rig of this sailing vessel, the boom and the gaff, to lift granite. So they'd sling the granite over on the rock, and then a brutal process to get these in place. The granite stones at the base, where that doorway is, those are 60 inches thick, 5 feet thick. And after a while, so for the first 20 years, they just lived in the tower, and it was wonderful. Lucky for me that it was originally set up for occupancy, because it's not granite on the inside. The building is built with the granite, circular granite tower. Then there's a 4-inch airspace, and then brick, which really dries the tower out. And so you don't have mold, you don't have moss growing in there and so forth. Like you do most towers like this, it's just granite, and it's like a terrarium inside. This picture was taken in 1952 with some buildings that are now gone. The boathouse right here, the boathouse survives. So down at the lower level, it's kind of hidden behind that thing there. But this is a boathouse down below. The upper level is living space. Seven levels in the tower, living space, bedroom, office, workshop, bedroom, and then these 2 levels up here. That's the outhouse. They didn't even have an outhouse here for like 50 years. That's the outhouse. This is called the fuel building, and it was against policy in all lighthouses to keep flammable fuels in the tower, because they were dealing with flammable fuels to keep the light going until the 30s or 40s when they electrified. So you had to keep that separate. So that building was 18 feet tall, and you can see it's on legs because in storms there's water underneath that. This thing here was a 42-foot tall bell tower. And there's a room there with a rope on it and a 1,000-pound bell up here. And in fog, anytime you're in fog, you're supposed to ring a bell for 5 seconds every minute if you're on a boat or on a lighthouse. We used to do it as kids when we were on boats. They would do it out there. And so you're in some god-awful storm, the least senior person of the two would have to be out here in the storm with waves breaking under. And I'll show you later, in the boathouse, there's a little window where the senior person could look out and just make sure the building's still there. And I'll show you that. And then this picture was taken in 42, when we were in World War II. And so these are RDF towers, radio direction finder towers that were put in for military. And in 42, when we were engaged in World War II, we doubled the staffing out there. We had 3 or 4 Navy people there at the same time, as well as the 2 or 3 lighthouse attendants. And there were so many people, they were sleeping in these buildings out here.
Wow.
But before World War II, lighthouse service was not a military operation. It was the U.S. Lighthouse Service, had been from George Washington's time until 1939 when we knew we were going to go into World War II. And prior to that, it was a very proud profession. It was the civil service, and you can see this fellow here. Oh, there's the light. That's the window right there where you could see, where they would look out to see the poor guy ringing the bell. This is John Douillet, who his family lived on the ship channel in South Portland. He was a lighthouse keeper at Halfway Rock for 29 years.
Wow.
And he'd be there for 2 weeks like everybody else. Once a week he'd go home and he'd row the 10 miles into Portland Harbor, drop off the peapod, and whoever had been on vacation the week before, or leave, whatever you call it, would row back out with some provisions and so forth. So he did that for 29 years.
Wow.
And they took the job very seriously. I'm going to show you that a lot of it was times of great boredom, but there were times when you really needed them was in a storm. And that's when you need a lighthouse. And there were times when you never knew before Channel 6, you never knew when there was a storm coming. And so they had to be prepared all the time. And when a storm came up, they had to keep the light going. And as I said, it was just a fuel oil wick. And they had to do all they could to keep that light as bright so it would be visible from as far away as possible. So they were constantly cleaning the inside lens up in the 7th story, and they had to clean the outside of the tower. And I will go back 2 pictures. If you see this, up there where the glass is, that's where the lens is. You can't get to that from inside the tower. You have to go up a ladder that's outside and clean the outside of that glass. So in the middle of a hurricane or a blizzard, when it's blowing as hard as it does in those conditions, again, the least senior person's got to go outdoors up a ladder with no protection and scrape everything off from that glass repeatedly. And as I said, I marvel at what they survived for weather, but I also, you got to imagine they didn't know what's coming, and it gets bad. They didn't expect it. Now it is bad. How long is it going to last? And one reason I have so much information about the lighthouse.
She's going to have to leave, but she can.
When I first was involved in this, I started reaching all over the place for information, and I found a woman at the National Archives in Washington, and I gave her this long story about, I'm in Maine, and I'm Casco Bay, and Lighthouse, and she said, "You bought Halfway Rock." And I said, "Whoa, yeah, I did." And I said, "Well," and I told her I was doing the historical research on it and everything. And I said, "Now, if you ever come across anything about Halfway Rock, like an old picture or something, here's my address, and send me a photocopy, and I'll be happy to reimburse you." And the next day, and then she said, "You're gonna love what I got for you." The next day, she said she just pressed send on her computer. They had digitized. The federal government has digitized all the records for every Air Force base, every landing strip, every lighthouse. I got 26,000 pages on Halfway Rock. And it goes back to when they were first thinking about having a lighthouse there, all the way through construction, with photos. And then, except for the 3 years that we were in World War II, I have every day's worth of log entries.
Wow.
And log entries sometimes were made once a day. Frequently they were made every half hour, and I've got them year after year after year. So here's one that I'll read to you, but that's exactly the way it appeared. This was after they finally got a typewriter out there. This is in 1953. No, 58. This is in March of 1958, and they had a typewriter set up, and I've got a picture of someone out there keeping those logs. And this is an entry in some cases, every half hour that day. The day starts, they don't know it's going to be a bad day, except at 6 a.m., they said that they're unable to see the other aids to navigation. So one thing you do in a lighthouse, at Halfway Rock, for example, they would always make sure they could see Seguin, 16 miles away. They could see Portland Head, 7 miles away. And if you couldn't see any of those lights, you'd get word to someone that something's gone wrong. So every night they would report they could see all the ATONs, aid to navigation. Every evening they could see all the ATONs. Here they couldn't at 6 in the morning. 3 hours later, they write, and the weather was okay. 6 hours later, 0900, winds, 75 miles per hour, 60-foot waves washing over the entire island. And that's what they wrote. And I can't believe, 60-foot waves is 2/3 of the way up the tower, and I know that there have been storms when the windows up in the tower got busted out. I can't believe 60-foot waves, but that's what, and they were professionals. Half an hour later, 0930, boat slip beginning to loosen, sagging to the danger point, wind vane lost. After lunch, before lunch, 1100 hours. Heavy frontal waves smashed in the sliding door, waves 50 feet, winds still force 12. 11:30, boat slip and foundation carried away, porch gone, all windows demolished.
Wow.
You know, and I've read so many of these episodes. Then they spend a week buttoning up, they'd come out from South Portland, they'd buy them, they'd have a new boat built that would show up a month later, and those were the moments of panic and intensity. And then you'd have months of solitude and routine, and it drove some people crazy. Some people literally developed serious problems living in such isolation, and some people adopted it as solitude and kept busy. They would hunt and fish out there and keep busy. In December of '42, Parade magazine, which I guess still exists, we all know it from the Press Herald. In '42, Parade magazine had a cover story with 12 pages of photos just about Halfway Rock and life on Halfway Rock. So these next photos kind of show you the routine of life out there. This is cleaning the Fresnel lens. And again, as I said, they had to clean it and polish it with a cloth so there wouldn't be any scratches, which would reduce the effectiveness of the light. They covered it with canvas during the day so the sun wouldn't degrade the glass. This is in the top level of the boathouse. When I bought Halfway Rock, there was nothing there, and I'll show you the pictures. I now have got a cook stove out there exactly like that one, sits right exactly by that window. There's a fella doing his, it's Arthur Stroud actually doing his laundry. More killing time. And another kind of a side responsibility that lighthouse keepers had for the federal government was to be good hosts to people, to visitors. And there were very infrequent visitors at Halfway Rock. But every time there was, it shows up in the journals that I have. And this is a group that came, a group of sailboat cruisers that stopped by. This is our guy, John Douillet, the lighthouse keeper, who'd been there for 29 years. And he's just hosting these people in the boathouse. I know every square inch of this boathouse intimately. I've scraped it and painted it. And if you look closely, everyone's either holding a dead cod or a lobster. There's a lobster, there's a cod, and everyone's holding that. And they just had a picnic there, but their part of their job was to be good hosts. And another person they were hosts to routinely was Santa Claus. Have you folks heard of the Flying Santa?
Yeah.
So in
Edward Rowe Snow came here.
Oh, he did. Well, see, that guy was a hero of historical stuff in Maine. You mean he came here to visit, or?
And Johanna von Teeling, who's deceased, somehow befriended him, and he would come here routinely.
Oh, wow, what a guy.
And he would drop presents off for the kids.
He did. Well, so in 1928, not Edward Rowe Snow, but a pilot out of Rockland got lost in his airplane, and he used lighthouses to find his way back, and he was grateful for that, and it got him thinking about what solitude this is. What do these folks do at Christmas? And so he started dropping off Christmas presents out of airplanes in the Penobscot Bay area, and then it spread, and Edward Rowe Snow got involved, and by the time Edward Rowe Snow died in the 50s, they were doing 90 lighthouses all the way down to Rhode Island on Christmas Day. And so he would go over Halfway Rock. This is not Halfway Rock, this is a lighthouse in Boston, but that's his plane, the Flying Santa. This is actually a log entry from Halfway Rock, 1935, and this log entry for that day at Halfway Rock says, moderate northwest wind, Santa arrived at 9:40 a.m., no rum. And so that was kind of the long-standing tradition of lighthouses that went on for decades, and then they modernized. And they clicked through modernization as fast as they could, because it was all about getting rid of the cost of this manpower and the maintenance of these buildings. This is the first piece of technology which was not effective, but it was a fog detector. And that was supposed to, someone sold this to the federal government, telling them it would, when the fog detector goes on, the fog horn would start sounding automatic.
Detectors are right here.
Did not, pardon? Yeah, right, did not work. And as I told you, here's the fog detector here, and this is when they had the radio direction finders for navigation. Submarines use these, ships use these. In 1960, they put in the helipad. It lasted until 1961. And there's still a piece of it out there. We've actually used it repeatedly, but you'd never know. It's just a little hunk of concrete now. And then by the 70s, just as soon as they could get their hands on solar panels, they put them out there. Very modest panels there. This is a weather station, and by 1975, they had put in generators, huge diesel tanks, so they could just ran the generators, 2 generators to create electricity and to run compressors for the horns. Ran them month after month with nobody there after 1975. And when they moved out in 75, I hope you all can see how ratty this is. Those are the big diesel tanks. This is a helicopter lifting a few things out, but basically they just threw everything in the ocean. All the files that were there are gone, but luckily the good stuff had been taken ashore to be digitized. But it was just a real wreck. The oil building is gone, the Bell building is gone, the 2 radio towers are gone, and it was about this time that the government, they were doing the best they could to mothball these, and then it sat for 40 years. They boarded up the windows shortly after this, but the boards fell off, the glass all was gone, there were birds living in the buildings. This is a 180-foot dock, and there's like 8 feet of it left there, gone in another storm. And so in 2014, as I said, I'm Earl Shuttleworth, who's a state historian, I have a relationship related to, and so around 2012, my father and I were in a boat going to Harpswell, and I said, we're just going to open the Press Herald someday, and this is going to be turned into a B&B or torn down, which would be worse. And so I called up Augusta, and I said, what do you think is going to happen to Halfway Rock? And he said, funny you should ask, it's going to be auctioned off. You got to wait a year. So I contacted the federal government and said, when you start auctioning this off, I do not know why I am involved and why I want to be involved in this, but let me know. And so the auction process started, and it is the craziest auction process. If you buy something from the federal government, so by law, if the federal government is going to get rid of anything, they have to auction it off on a website. And it could be a case of cell phone chargers from cell phones they don't even make anymore, or a pallet of Kleenex, or a destroyer in Guam, or an Air Force base, and all the lighthouses. So, and you go on gsaauctions.gov, and you can do it right now. They got broken down helicopters and stuff, and the lighthouses. So they start this process, and the way it works is you bid, and then someone bumps the bid, but they will, every time, the auction ends when 24 hours passes without a bid, which means months. So the auction started in mid-July, it ended in mid-September, and so I was involved. Like, people are going up like $100 at a whack or $500 at a bid, and it just went and went and went. And I had, when I'd gone out to see the lighthouse with, the government won't let you buy something crazy unless they know you've looked at it and you've signed a log saying, I've seen this helicopter with no wings on it or whatever, no blades on it, or this lighthouse. And so when they came out from South Freeport with 10 of us who were going to be bidders, I ended up sitting next to this guy named Art Gerard, who had just bought Boone Island. he had been one of the bidders. You might remember a story that was in the Press Herald 10 years ago when a surgeon, who was a friend of mine, Jeffrey Florman, had been bidding against somebody else to buy Ram Island Light, which is the one right across the ship channel from Portland Light. And these two nuts were bidding the price way, way up. And Art Gerard called up the doctor, the ultimate owner, and said, "This is nuts. All we're doing is giving money to the federal government. I will flip you for it." So this guy was in surgery, so we met him at the front door of Maine Medical Center. They flipped the coin, and Art lost, and Jeffrey Florman won. And the next day, the auction was over. He got Ram Island Light. So Art Gerard then went and bought Boone 2 weeks before I'm trying to be hoping I'm going to be a competitive bidder for Halfway Rock, and we're all in the same boat going out there. I thought, oh shoot, Art Gerard is going to buy Halfway Rock. I haven't got a prayer. So I sat next to him, thinking I'd get close to the enemy. And again, this is before the bidding even started. It had just started, I guess. And I sat next to him and introduced myself, and he said, you weren't related to the guy who was principal of Portland High School, were you? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, man. He said, when I dropped out of school in 9th grade, he said, he just kept me coming back to school, and he was so good to me, and I cannot bid against you for Halfway Rock. And he adopted me as his project. And so the guy who I ended up bidding against was a billionaire. He owned Polaroid at the time that he's bidding against me. He's from Boston, billionaire, and he's going to turn it into some weird project. And so Art Gerard was calling me all the time. We're having this auction going on, strategizing on how to do an internet bid, and it didn't go anywhere. It dragged on. So finally, Art Gerard called up this billionaire from Portland and said, "You do not want Halfway Rock. Have you seen it? It's a piece of crap. But I own a big shot like you ought to have Boone Island, the biggest lighthouse in New England." And Boone Island is one of these terrarium lighthouses I was telling you about. And so, just as a favor that this man did for me, because he adored my grandfather, Art said, I'll get a helicopter. I'm going to pick you up in Boston. I'm going to take you to Boone. I'll take you to Halfway Rock. And he did. And then Art said to this guy, I will give you Boone Island for what I paid for it if you go away today. And so I had Halfway Rock the next day, which was great. I'm sorry for the very long story, but someone last night was asking me, how did you do all these projects without permits? Because I built the dock is now 180 feet long, but when I bought it, you saw it was just that stuff, and we rebuilt the dock before I bought it. We did lots of things while it was still owned by the federal government, because I knew I was quite optimistic I was going to be able to own it. Even though I was a high bidder, I hadn't paid for it, hadn't closed. And the reason we got delayed for a year was because of a title problem. I was not going to do a title search. So anyone who's on real estate knows you always do a title search, because something could have happened 40 years ago that would mean you don't really own what you think you're paying for. But I know a lot about this. And I thought, well, no one's ever owned this property except the federal government, ever. And now I'm the second owner, so what could have gone wrong? But my lawyer said, you cannot imagine how bad the government can mess things up, because he had just done the title search for Art Gerard on Boone Island, and it was a disaster. So I said, okay, do a title search. And a week later, he called me up and he said, I told you so. He had gone back to the first deed in Maine, 1622, in his research, because he could not establish that the federal government ever owned it. He'd gone back to King George III, to Ferdinand Gorges, which was all his property, an original deed. And he said the federal government thinks they own the rock, and they only own the buildings. And the reason was that after the Civil War, the government had all these people who were stonemasons, all this granite left over, and they went on a flurry of building lighthouses. And someone in Washington said, okay, we're going to do a lighthouse here and here and here, and Halfway Rock and Casco Bay, and here and here and here. And they said, go get title to all these pieces of property. So some bureaucrat in Washington in 1868 or so went and got title to Halfway Rock in Boston Harbor. And no one knew until I had the title search done. So the federal government owned all these buildings, been a federal installation the whole time. And we had, and so I thought, well, how hard can this be? We'll go and get the governor to sign off, because they never owned it anyway. We got the governor to deed from the state of Maine back to the federal government. We'll have our auction. Well, this was when Paul LePage was mad at the legislature. This was 2015, and some of you may remember, he would not sign any of the environmental bills or any of the bills for Lands for Maine Future or anything to do with a lighthouse. So he wouldn't sign it. And at the same time, he's fighting with Janet Mills, who was then the Attorney General, and she said, you don't have authority to do this anyway. So I had to hire a lobbyist to go up and schmooze these people in Augusta, which is a gross, I hope none of you are lobbyists, it's a gross process. And I just felt dirty in the whole thing, but eventually, the Maine legislature passed a special law, LD 2404, just to authorize Maine's purchase of that rock, Maine's sale of that rock to the federal government for appraised value, and the federal government would buy it. And then I had to get an appraiser, a qualified appraiser, to appraise the rock without the buildings on it. So that was $40,000. So the federal government paid the state of Maine $40,000 in the morning of whenever I closed on this. That afternoon, I wrote one check and it was all resolved, but it took 13 months to do that.
Oh, wow.
So then I owned this. And Chris was asking at lunch whether there was any point at which I wasn't having a blast, and it was right now. Because I know about construction, but I also, I focused on the condition of this place, and I knew you can't not do something. I had to see this thing that I had started through. So this was the condition of the building. I had peeled, this is actually after I put that window back in. There had been no glass there. That's the roof on the east side. And you can see part of the roof is missing. When we repaired that, we found sand and seaweed up there on the roof. There's that little window where you peek to see if your buddy's still around. This is from the inside. The top of the boathouse, which is really about the size of the room we're in. It's a little squarer than this, but it's this square footage. In the 60s, the Coast Guard divided that space into this. It was 6 dinky little rooms. And this is it was lead paint. We hauled so much lead paint out of there.
Oh, my God.
This is, I had a lot of help. I had 2 guys from Harpswell who were committed. Everyone was committed, but these 2 guys were with me from beginning to end. And he was a bibber, and that's like being a McVeigh on Long Island, or there are lots of bibbers in Harpswell, and this guy was a worker, but he was related to everyone back in Harpswell, and so we didn't know we had to get a building permit eventually and a burning permit. We had one fire out there, and all the lobstermen got on the VHF and started calling around what's going on at Halfway Rock. So we realized we were so visible that we ought to stop playing by the rules at this point. So we couldn't get any permits because we weren't in a town. And so I called my lawyer and I said, do I get to pick my town? And he said, yeah. And so this guy who's a bibber was related to bibbers in the fire department, bibbers in town hall. So I said, get a building permit. So I called Harpswell Town Hall and I said, can I be in Harpswell? And they knew all about it. He said, yeah, welcome. And so then he immediately called the bibber who gives building permits and the bibber who gives burning permits, and we were in business. And then we just started tearing. Again, there had been so much. There had been a lot of ratty additions inside the wood structure in the 60s, and so we started just tearing it out. We came across this plaster that I knew had been put in there as insulation because it was so cold. This is not in the granite tower, this is in the wood building. But I did not think that we would come across this pretty beadboard. There's the 1960s camp paneling, and there's the beaver board, and there's the plaster, and there's all these layers of paint. And underneath was this varnished beadboard, and the whole inside of the building turns out to be this stuff. And it was a real treat. And in one corner, which is the corner that would, if you looked out that box right there, which used to be a window, you'd be looking right at Cliff. That's where this thing is. This is in the living room. There's only a kitchen in the living room. But There was a time in 1898 when we were in the Spanish-American War, which went for only a year and a half, but there was a panic after, I think it was in Havana Harbor where the ship, the USS Maine, was sunk. Washington, D.C. was in a panic that we were going to have this war spread up the East Coast. And so they started thinking the lighthouses would be a good way to find out if we're being invaded. And if we give all the lighthouses carrier pigeons, which is a stupid idea in retrospect, if we give everyone carrier pigeons, they can send the birds in to South Portland Coast Guard group and say we're being invaded. And what really happened is these guys, it only worked for one season, and it was communicating with girlfriends and stuff like that. But that door, I'm convinced was where the pigeons were launched, because it just went right straight to the air. So we started tearing apart everything that was new construction, and by new construction I mean like from the 30s onward. And when we tore one wall apart, this was in the wall between the Granite Tower and the boathouse, there's this bottle in there. And remember I told you that in 1939 they had militarized the lighthouse, U.S. Lighthouse Service. So this has been this very proud group that thought it was going to go on forever, of brass buttons and uniforms, U.S. Lighthouse Service. And then, like with 60 days notice, everything's going to be U.S. Coast Guard, forget the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And so notice came out, and these guys, everyone was upset in the U.S. Lighthouse Service. So that relates to this bottle. New Year's Eve, you cannot have booze in a lighthouse. New Year's Eve, 1938, right after they found that they're going to lose their jobs, they finish off a bottle of Cobb's Creek, and it says Christmas, 1938, Bill Clark, and he is the grandson of Jim Cram, who's the director of the Freeport Historical Society, and Arthur Strout, who's the guy whose picture you saw shining everything up. Those guys finished off this bottle, signed it, and jammed it in the wall they were building. They had just gotten a refrigerator, and they built a wall around the refrigerator, and they closed this thing in, thinking it would be a good joke for someone like me to find. So that was our the demo process ended, and we quickly went into the restoration process, and this was the second year I'd been involved. And there was so much work to do, and it's really hard getting people to work out there, except for this core of people who were really into it. And I was warming up for the next summer, thinking how we're going to do all this with a few projects I did not know how to do. And I got a call from a TV production company that was trying to sell something to the Discovery Channel, and they wanted to. They had done lots of TV shows in Alaska and had run out of everything cool in Alaska, and they thought Maine was the next place to find stuff to do, nuts to film. And so they contacted me and wanted to do a thing at Halfway Rock, and I said no. There's no reason that I would have benefited from this, because I really did this undercover for a long time, because I thought people would think I had lost my mind, and so lots of people didn't even know I was involved, and I just didn't want the attention, and I didn't want the bother, and my workers did not want the distraction of people around. But they kept offering me money and more money, and so finally they offered me $40,000, and I said, if you take care of yourselves and you get helicopters, and I don't need to wait on you and get you food, and that will be fine. So they ended up coming for that summer. They said, okay, this is, we really have got to have you on a construction schedule that's predictable, and we're going to come 7 times for 2 days each time, and we'll stay out of your way. They came and went by helicopter. They showed up with 2 sound people, a producer, 2 camera people, and they were great. And the magic of it for me was we just cranked through that summer and got all this stuff done. And by the end of the summer, the project was done, and I'd still be picking away at it if I didn't have that pressure. So the first thing we did was build the pier, and because we couldn't when we went to Halfway Rock, we would just be banging up on the rocks. We would have a load of lumber and people. First time I took my wife out there, my wife and a puppy, and I had my 2 guys from Harpswell who were already there, and I took my wife out there to see it, and we pulled up in a boat, and it was not even rough, and a wave caught us, and these two big young men are holding the boat stable while they step out. It swung the boat around and snapped the engine right off the boat. There's nothing left but the two little screwy things on the transom. So we had to get a dock built because boats on rocks was not working out at all. So
Whoa.
that's 180 feet of new dock, and so that's dead low. As the tide comes in, it comes way up there, but we have that ramp, which is wicked slippery. When we go out there, we park my orange boat. I have a Coast Guard boat that comes and goes. We park my old Coast Guard boat out on a mooring, and we bring an Avon or some other kind of boat in, and that's been a disaster with boat after boat that we've lost before and after the dock went in. And then we put on ice grippers like it's slippery, like it's slippery out, and because it's so slippery going up there. And that's how we came and went. But that was our first restoration project out there. Then we put in moorings, and that's a size 12 sneaker right there. That's the size of the chain that holds the moorings in place. And before we could start on the building, we had to pin down the boat situation for getting everything out there. This is the way it used to be. Peapods are double-ended boats because when you leave here, you've got to go out bow first. And so they would actually slide, we still do this, but not with such grace. They would store it in the boathouse and slide right down, and then they'd row out. Since the 1960s, the Coast Guard has not gone, they've deemed Halfway Rock too dangerous to go to by boat for the Coast Guard. So when I won the auction, the commandant or some big shot in Coast Guard Group Boston called me and he said, have you been there? And I said, yeah. He said, well, you can't go by boat, And I said, well, I go by boat a lot. He said, well, we haven't gone by boat since the 1960s. And they go by helicopter. And because they just, it's young men who are not highly experienced in boats always. The guys changing light bulbs in lighthouses are not the most experienced people in the Coast Guard. And we are most seasoned, although they're all been very nice to me. They come in this thing, and this comes from Boston. So when they service a lighthouse, one of the wave-swept lighthouses, they bring this thing up by Boston, and it's too big to land on the rocks, so they rappel. I've been up there having a picnic on the top of the lighthouse, and these guys rappel. They're right beside us in this thing, and they rappel out of that, come in and change a bulb, and then they go on to Monhegan. This is the boat I ended up getting. It's an old Coast Guard boat. It used to have a machine gun on the bow and the stern. It's bulletproof. It's indestructible. It's not an inflatable. It's actually a foam sides. It's got night vision. It's got all kinds of gear that is maybe more than I need, but it's handy for Halfway Rock, and that's what gets us out there.
Wow.
This is again, you don't see many whitecaps out there, but this is how rough is parked on the mooring. And this boat, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of boats lost in action here. That aluminum boat there, we popped all the rivets and we welded the aluminum seams, and those all broke, and that got set aside in the junk pile at Halfway Rock. That boat right there is one of 3 inflatables I've had out there, and this is the first winter I put that thing high and dry, way up by the barn door, lashed it down, thinking this will be safe for the winter. When I went back in the spring, that's all that was left. And then we had a Boston Whaler, which I'd grown up thinking was indestructible, and they are not. And that boat we destroyed. And so we had these boats.
Oh my God.
We had these boats that were out there, and I needed a bedroom, and we didn't have any beds, and so I thought maybe I can make bunks out of these things. So here's where I've carved the destroyed tin boat. You can see that's the radius for the inside of the tower, and then that's my granddaughter up there on the top, the Boston Whaler and the tin boat are bunks on the first floor of the tower.
Oh my God.
And I was saying at lunch, I thought that was a cheap way to recycle, and then I had to have custom-made mattresses. That's one of my kids working, and I had these people who were dedicated. There are people who are lighthouse masons. They travel all over the East Coast. I had to wait 2 years to get these people. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second.
Wow.
We wore bunny suits when we were dealing with lead paint. We resided everything. So I had, when you have a building on the National Register, you can't do any work until it's proposed and approved by the federal government, and in the state of Maine, the federal government is the Maine Historic, their reps in Maine is the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. So I had to go and lay out everything I was doing. I'd approved to them that the windows that were in place were too far gone to salvage before I could throw them away. And I get all that, but it was a lot of paperwork and a lot of planning. You see up here, they wouldn't let me remove those clapboards because they were original and not destroyed enough to replace. And so you have to have all these approvals. You also have to pick your period of interpretation, because this lighthouse had been 1871 to now. You're going to restore it to 1875 or 1975. So I picked 1950 because I had a lot of data on the 1940s and the late 40s, and so I said I'll pick 1948, 1950 as a period of interpretation. So that's what we did there, and we just cranked through all these carpentry projects. It was like doing something on Cliff, where everything comes from the mainland. And you forget a gallon of paint, and you got to go back to the main. And at Halfway Rock, you get to the top, and you forgot the Phillips head screwdriver, and you get 142 steps to go back down and get that. But the biggest problem we had out there, is that thunder out there?
Yeah.
This is the 7th level. This is the 6th level of the lighthouse, and this is granite that's moved in a storm or something. But it's moved, and it's got gaps that are supposed to be too tight to fit your finger in. You could easily fit a fist in some of those spots. And they're bringing water in. Water's coming in, dropping down all the way down through the whole lighthouse, freezing in the winter, moving it further apart. You said you're leaving at 3, so it's my clue. I gotta speed up
Not
here.
a clue, this is amazing.
So I had no idea how we were going to solve this, and I did not know if it was something that was going to get ahead of me and I wouldn't be able to handle. So I waited 2 years to get those masons that I told you about a second ago, and the masons said, "We'll be there summer after next, and we're going to have scaffolding, but we don't do scaffolding." And then I contacted a scaffolding company, and they said, "Well, we can get you scaffolding, but we don't do the delivery." So I contacted some barge companies. One local one did not dare do it. One from Rockland wanted $58,000, and God bless Coley Mulkern from Peak. So I guess you guys does something for you guys, right?
Yeah.
He took very good care of me. We met one Sunday morning with forklifts and flatbed trailers and the scaffolding company and 22 people and a barge on Munjoy Hill, at the beach at Munjoy Hill, and we loaded 45,000 pounds of scaffolding onto that barge. We came out, we had 2 hours of high tide before the barge had to leave because there wouldn't be enough water for them, and we unloaded it. And it was like an ant farm out there for 2 hours, and we unloaded all that.
Oh my God.
And we put it up. And when we got that high, someone from the scaffolding company said, we made a mistake. And we only brought half as much scaffolding as we need. So we had to do the whole thing again, and the next time we had to wait. We had 3 false starts with weather cancellations before we came back out. And of course, the film crew's crawling all over the barge. And they came back out a second trip, and we got everything up. And then this was, I don't know if any of you saw this, but it was like this for a month. We were painting, filling all those cracks in the masonry. It went great. And it was done. We even painted the top, the very top. And this, you've got to be a special breed of cat to want that job.
Yeah.
And this guy did not mind being up there at all. The bugs were brutal, and he smoked. And I went up there one time. I went up there a couple times. He wasn't wearing his harness, but for the filming, he'd wear his harness. And this is with a drone, like right near him. I went up there one time, and the bugs were so bad, he had taken his t-shirt off and put it over his head and tied it, and he smoked, and there's just some little slits right in the butt. So we finished it, and this is what it looks like now. That's the that's the bedroom for the light keeper. They had a little office. We put all the stuff out there because there's nothing out there. We completely restored the kitchen, put this in place.
Wow.
That's all slate we took out. That stove we took out in one of the little boats, and it rusted out because the stovepipe failed the first winter. So now I've taken a second one out.
Oh, no.
And that's it. And after, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this when we get to the part about writing the book. But in the future, if I were writing a book about local history, I would get the word out there early, so that people who know something can get to you early. Because it kind of leaked out, and people would say, "What's going on at Halfway Rock?" And I'd get these calls, "Geez, so and so is a lighthouse keeper out there, and he lives in Phippsburg," or "I've got photos from my grandfather who lived there." And so word got out to me too slowly. I was not good at that. But I have this photo from 1960 of this gentleman. And this is him in 2017, and he tracked me down. And the people who did the Discovery Channel thing said, "Oh, get him up. We'll fly him out here," because he's standing in front of the RDF tower there, and now the tower's gone, and Ken's still around. And that was a real thrill for him, and I think that's in the video.
Wow.
So anyway, that is my story about restoring the lighthouse. As I said, that it had it had recognition for being decrepit early on, all that I told you about. Since the restoration, the federal government, the American Lighthouse Foundation, which had worked with the federal government to try to find an owner, they couldn't get anyone to take it originally. They awarded this the highest national award for a lighthouse restoration in 2017. Lighthouse Digest, which had given it the Doomsday article for the poster child for most endangered. They did this is the cover story. After the restoration, they called it the Miracle Restoration in Casco Bay. And Maine Preservation, which had put it on its list of most endangered buildings in Maine, gave us a preservation award. So it was good outcome. So that's
Wow, that's awesome.
and someone is going to ask me, what do you do with this now? So we use it. It's not locked. So anyone who wants, it's very dangerous to get there. I really worry for anyone who goes, but it's there. People are welcome to go ashore. Day like this would be fine, but you've got to really watch when you go. But we use it for family functions. We've been there twice this week, going back out Sunday with friends. But we'll get there probably 10 times this summer. 4th of July, to be 76 feet in the air, looking back at all this, when the sun sets. 2 years ago, we counted 58 sets of of fireworks at once. You can see Sebago. You can see way up the Kennebec into Bath. It's just spectacular. And we had a wedding there, so that's what this was. Our youngest child, and his Sarah, who is a Buston's Island kid, got engaged out there. When they got engaged, they destroyed an engine. They went ashore and got fouled on some stuff, and it was so rough. The only way to free the engine up from the stuff it was stuck on, lobster traps in a storm will turn into tumbleweeds, and they just completely compress, and 10 to 12 lobster traps will make a ball about the size of that table right there. And they got their engine hung up on one of these things. And so they brand new 20 horsepower Yamaha, throw it over the boat because they had gone. So I retrieved it, but it wasn't salvageable. So anyway, they got engaged, and they had a wedding out there, and only by helicopter. And we had 32 trips that went from Wolf's Neck, 32 round trips to get out there and back. It was supposed to be 32, but my wife ran out of ice cubes. I had to go to Bow Street Market. Most expensive ice cubes I ever bought. And the wedding invitation warned everybody about footgear, and the wedding invitation said, "If your shoes are cute, you've done the wrong thing." So that's what we do at Halfway Rock.
Oh, that's awesome.
So if it's okay, I'll tell you a little bit about writing the book
Yes.
and then let you guys go. So I didn't, I'll be happy to answer questions too. I didn't set out to write a book, but I got obsessed. I've done a lot of historic research. I've done other things in historic preservation, and so I went at this with a vengeance, looking for photos. As I told you, I ended up with 26,000 things from the pages from the government, but I also was combing newspapers and combing the internet for anything I could find, personal histories. I've talked to 6 individuals who lived at Halfway Rock, and I've recorded all their personal histories, which I know you folks are thinking about doing here on Cliff. And I rounded up all that information just out of personal interest, and then I did the restoration. I thought, well, maybe this is an interesting story, and the book was ready to write itself because I had so much stuff. So I put all that together, and then I thought, well, you know, I've got to publish it. And it's not, local histories, you don't get any money for this. No one pays you to do this. There are 2 ways to do it, and you don't make money either way. One is if you get a publisher, and we've seen these small local histories, like the history of North Yarmouth or something like that. And the way those deals work is a publisher will agree to front the production costs, and they'll handle all the order fulfillment, and you've got to guarantee, say, 1,500 book sales. And that means, and they don't give you any money. And so you've got to go around and do book signings and all this other stuff. And then if you're lucky, you make a few bucks, but you at least break even because they've front-ended all this. They've done a lot of the work. I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to come to play cool places like Cliff to do this. But I get asked all the time, and I've said no for 2. It's the first time I've done this in 2 years. And I didn't want to be dealing with someone telling me what I had to do. And so that meant I had to finance this myself. I'm going to if anyone's interested in doing this, I'm going to share with you the numbers of how this works. But I'll tell you something else. I get asked to give this talk, and I do it infrequently, and I get asked to take people to Halfway Rock, which I do very infrequently, you know, for benefits, like for auctions and stuff. But I'm on the board at Maine Maritime Museum, and I said, I'll do it if you can get $1,000. And this is kind of a lesson about how generous the public has been to nonprofits in COVID. I hope you've seen that here. Maine Maritime Museum has seen a lot of generosity from its supporters. So I said, you get someone to guarantee $1,000, and you can auction off Halfway Rock. And they called back and they said, this will not be a problem. And I said, well, if you can get a lot, I'll do more. And so the auction was 2 weeks ago. They got $15,000 for 3 trips to Halfway Rock. So that was, and again, that was just people being known. They did twice as well as they were done at that auction. I think the other nonprofits have had the same type of success. But anyway, so I self-published it. It means I had my own schedule. I could do my own thing. But I had to figure out how to edit this and how to lay out pages and how to move books. And as I said, we're interested in this, but you know, I've sold 1,000. I've parted company with 1,000 of these. Sold some and given some away, and that's a pretty good. People think that's pretty good for a local history, but there's not big money in publishing books. Before I get into the elements of producing, I'm just going to tell you how I researched. I told you I had all this stuff. The Press Herald is not helpful. I thought, here's a paper that's been in business throughout the whole time. They have nothing, they don't have anything indexed, and so you can't find any articles. A lot of the newspapers have things indexed. Bangor Daily News is great. Newspapers all around the country are great. Nothing's indexed. And the Press Herald sold all their photographs to some company in California, which is going to someday put them online for money, but they're not sorted, they're not available. So I ended up doing all these crazy Google and internet searches for articles that were published in the Press Herald but showed up in the Boise Tribune or something like that, because things get reprinted. So if you happen to look at the book sometime, lots of my quotes for local news stories come from these far off newspapers that happen to reprint something from the Press Herald. So that made it very hard. But if you're researching, I will tell you, do Google searches with all different types of word combinations, because I did hundreds of Google searches, and I just changed the wording or kind of come at it backwards, and bingo, stuff showed up. Is a very effective way to research. Also, maritime museums and libraries, historical societies are very rapidly digitizing everything they have, and you don't need to go anywhere to research anymore. Every time I took something, I took great scans. It was with my iPhone. There was high quality iPhone stuff, probably good enough, and I scanned everything with high resolution into Dropbox. There's another one, Google Chrome, I guess, or something like that. But there are websites where you can just jam everything you've written, all your photos, and I put together this massive Word document, and that's what we did. So here's how it got, and I had 3 discrete stories that I wanted to tell. They kind of like the way I present it to you today. The history of the lighthouse, the history of the restoration, and they had 3, this has 3 elaborate appendices, footnotes, where I wanted to tell about something that really wasn't about the lighthouse, and then the accounts of the oral histories that I got from the lighthouse keepers. And then one other part that's in there. So I just laid it out sequentially. I worked, every day for 2-3 hours, crank out half a chapter and go back and do it again. And soon it was done, and I had to figure out how to get it produced. And so here's how I did that. I did not have confidence that I could write in a way that was interesting reading. And so I hired an editor, and this lady, Lucy Teagarden, who lives in Brunswick, and for 25 years she edited every book that was published at Bowdoin by anybody. Wow. They had everything go across this woman's desk. And it turns out she didn't change any of my wording, but if I had abbreviated something that should have been written out long, or I wrote USCG for Coast Guard, but it's supposed to be U period, period all the way through. Yes. She made all those changes for internal consistency. And she also made sure all my footnotes were right. And so you have to do that if you're going to do a good job on a book. And she made sure that I had appropriate accreditation for all these photos that I'd just been grabbing off the internet and everything else. I had to go back and find out where they really came from. And there was only one where I was winging it. She was such a stickler, I made up the information. This photo right here, because I had no idea where it came from. And it's this magnificent photo from 1885 of people seine netting off Halfway Rock. And so I made that up. Remember my story about Art Gerard, the guy that got me the light? He bought the photo. He bought the painting. It's hanging over my fireplace now. So the only thing I cheated on, I ended up owning. So I had her as an editor, and then what you have to do is you've got to get people who do layout. So there was a couple, couple who specializes in doing historical books. They live on Town Landing in Falmouth. They've done stuff all over the country, beautiful books for art museums and histories and so forth. And they restored my photos, and then they sized all the photos. That if this, let me find something else. If this is the page where I'm talking about this guy drying his laundry, the text has to be on the same page. And it's not a very important part of the story, so it's not a very big photo. But if it was, it would be bigger. So they have to make sure the text matches the photo, and the photo is bigger, small, as is appropriate. So for economics, I paid the woman who was my editor $5,000, and I paid these folks who laid out all these $8,000. And then what those folks, the layout folks, also handled the publisher, the printer rather. And I wanted to have it printed in Maine on Maine paper, impossible, ridiculously expensive. But I didn't want to do it in China either, so we did print it domestically. And they set the whole thing up, and I had to pay $18 for the paperbacks. So I've gotten like $30 a book. It cost me $30 a book. I sell them for 25. So it's a continuation of the profit model. But that's the economics of it, and so you can break even. If anyone's thinking of doing it, you can do it yourself and break even. And that's the end of my story. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes?
Oh, I do have a question. That was fabulous. Thank you for agreeing to come and when the lighthouse keeper had their break time and rowed into shore.
Yeah.
Where did they go to? Like
A
the
lot of them lived
Portland
here.
or Here.
A lot of them lived locally.
Yeah.
The Strout family from Cape Elizabeth, I bet there were 6 of them that were lighthouse keepers. You know, so if you had seniority, you lived near your family.
Yeah.
If you were young,
Yeah.
you might be stationed in Rockland, even though you're from Cliff.
So it wasn't like they went all the way into the mainland necessarily.
Well, they went to Portland. Well, no, they had to, because the person who was, there's someone waiting for that Peapod when you get ashore to come back out, so they always went into town.
So the follow-up to that is, were there many accidents or loss of life, or over the course of the time there were lighthouse keepers rowing in?
There has been lots of loss of life on the coast of Maine, never at Halfway Rock. After the lighthouse went in, there was
Yeah.
lots, there were 3 significant shipwrecks that were with loss of life before the lighthouse.
Yeah, but not with the guys rowing the Peapod.
Right. The most disappointing, they busted up the Peapod all the time.
I'm sure.
And the first time, in the 30s, they had a radio. There was a company called Atwater Kent, and the owner of the company, something Atwater, felt so sorry for these lighthouse keepers, he gave a free radio to every lighthouse in America. And then in the 60s, I'm coming back to the boat story, in the 60s they got their first TV, and they were rowing it ashore in the Peapod, and the Peapod tipped over, and they lost. But they had telephone out there before it was on the mainland. They were hardwired, and the wire kept breaking, but they were hardwired. Yeah.
I have a question that I brought up at Brook Group, and I was sort of requested to bring it up here, so I'll make it brief. You've done an incredible job, thank you. What is the forward thinking? How will you manage to maintain it, and the logistics, the expenses? Is there going to be a trust, that kind of?
Yeah, it's not very. It was so bad after 40 years of total neglect. That was expensive. It's not expensive to maintain it now. If I lose the dock, that will, and I will eventually, a hurricane or something. But I don't think it's going to cost a lot, and it's kind of there aren't a lot of moving parts out there. I've set it up so. And I said we don't get many thunderstorms.
You just said that.
There's a webcam at Halfway Rock, and we never get thunderstorms out there because they peter out by the time they get out.
That's what he just said.
I can't remember what the question I was.
It's about the trust.
Oh yeah, so there aren't a lot of moving parts. I'm very lucky. My kids all live here, and they're all interested in it. So it'll go on for a while. We'll keep it in good shape longer than it would have been otherwise. And I will give it. We'd give it away. You know, we'd give it away restored if we weren't taking care of it.
Great, thank you.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah, Heath.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It's great. I was just wondering, you mentioned some people handled the solitude well and others did not. Was there ever a time when people had to go and actually retrieve the person on the rock?
Yeah. There was it was always a team of 3, and one of the 3 was from Harpswell, and he just couldn't hold it together, and he was in good mental stability when he arrived, and a couple years later he'd take the Peapod and disappear for days, you know, and then he started saying he was going to kill President Grant, and then he said he was going to kill the other 2 guys who didn't want to sleep anymore after that happened. So there was so much bureaucracy in the lighthouse service. Nothing happened quickly. I've got all the letters of these guys going to Portland going to Boston going to Washington, D.C. to get rid of this guy, and eventually they relocated him. Yes?
A quick follow-up to Steve's question about what I call the psychology of light keeping. If you're really interested in essentially the devolution of sanity, see the movie The Lighthouse. I think it was released in 2019. It's an indie movie, and it's really an incredible movie. It's a senior person and a junior person. And I don't know what the time frame was supposed to be, early 1900s.
It's kind of the same story.
Pardon?
Is it a similar story to the one I just related?
It is similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really becomes the psychosis of
Yeah.
lighthouse keeping.
Yeah, well,
It's a very powerful movie about, evolving into madness.
yeah.
So-
Well, listen, I'll tell you, I can't imagine anything more alone than being in a place with no plants or people. Great, well, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. When I asked him, he did say, I've stopped doing this, but I'm partial to islands, so we were very lucky. So if you want him to sign it, we'll do that. There are refreshments, delicious cookies and lemonade, so I'll meet them.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll make it out to you.
Don't forget to sign up if you're interested. Yeah, Shelley, you Thanks for trying.
Great, we'll make it out to you.
I want to wait here.
Yes, I'd be happy to. How to make it out?
Jay, I gotta sign up.
Everybody, there's lemonade if you want
She had a bad night.
Is that why you need it here?
Yeah, she was going to come, and then we had to run on the screen over to Charlie. So that's on the then we went back, and she was some my name on that list. There's some
You better eat up. I'm in the library.
Yeah, just put that in the library.